I want to start off by introducing myself. My name is Barry Logan. I'm a forensic toxicologist, and I'm the current president of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. AAFS is the largest professional forensic science organization in the world. It has over 7,000 members in the United States. It's an organization that promotes professional development in forensic science and continuing education for forensic scientists. And this is the first webinar that AAFS has offered as an outreach event to try to introduce prospective forensic scientists to the field of forensic science and to encourage people who are already engaged to look for ways to advance and progress in their careers. So we will be having a series of 11 of these sessions over the next 2 months, one for each section of the AAFS. More information about the organization you'll find at our website, www.aafs.org. And this evening's presentation, the first in the series, is being given by the Criminalistics section. Dr. Larry Coronel, Dr. Dwight Adams, and Dr. Steve Lee will be introducing you to information about professional activities and careers in the field of criminalistics. So with that, I'll turn it over to the first presenter, who is Larry Quarino.
Okay. Thank you, Barry. Welcome, everybody. I am, okay, how do I, okay, I'm having problems advancing. Boy. Okay. Jeff, my screen seems to be locked.
If you can't, I would click in the PowerPoint, press escape, and see if that minimizes the window. We can still see your mouse move around.
No.
Okay, just a sec. Let me pull the screen away from you real quick. Are you able to advance now?
Yeah. Oh boy. Okay, I am now. Does the audience see this?
I am not seeing it yet from your screen.
All right. Are we good to go?
It looks like it.
Okay. All right. Sorry about those technical glitches there for a second. I'm Larry Quarino. I am the program. The same thing is happening. Jeff, I don't have control of the screen.
Are you sharing just that window or sharing your whole screen?
Yeah. Sharing the screen.
Okay. I might try sharing just the PowerPoint window the way I showed you before, below the pause play button.
If you'd like, I have the penultimate version on my computer. We could give my computer a try. And Larry, you can just speak to the slides and I can advance them for you.
All right, let's just try that one last thing.
Okay.
Okay. It's not letting me pick the application.
Hmm. Steve, why don't we move over to your computer and see if that works?
Okay. All right. Are you seeing the PDF of the PowerPoint?
We are.
Okay. Let's see if I can advance. Yep. Larry, can you see the PowerPoint?
I can see it. I can.
Okay.
All right, so I think we're finally ready to go. I'm Larry Quarino. I am the director of the Forensic Science program at Cedar Crest College, and on the webinar with me is Dr. Dwight Adams from Central Oklahoma University and Dr. Steve Lee from San Jose State University. And one of the things that we all have in common is prior to us entering academia, we were all forensic science practitioners. So we have the experience of both teaching and actually being a practitioner. And just to give you a little bit about ourselves, I had spent a good part of my career at the New York City Medical Examiner's Office. Dr. Adams was a 23-year veteran at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, in which he retired as director, and Dr. Lee was a criminalist with the California state system, and his bona fides are right there in front of you. He's also has his PhD from in molecular biology, I believe, from Cal Berkeley. And we're all members of the American Academy. Okay, so we want to give you, and not really sure of the background of all the folks that are joining us this evening. I suspect we have a lot of students, folks who are in the early parts of their career, and a lot of this information you may already know. And but hopefully there is a couple of pointers at least that we could provide for each of you that we think could be beneficial. So I would invite Dr. Adams and Dr. Lee to speak at any point here in case there's some things that I am forgetting. What I'd like to do is of course start at the very beginning, and you know there are probably three pertinent questions that we can start with. The first is, of course, is what is forensic science? Next slide, Steve. Okay, and it probably isn't this, right? And it probably isn't the next slide. And it probably isn't this. But it's probably something that, admittedly, a lot of people have gotten very interested in forensic sciences because of things in the popular culture. And I think the popular culture started to get interested in forensic science when forensic science started to having a significant influence into the criminal justice system, which I think happened in the 1990s, which is something that I think we'll talk about. Anyway, by definition, of course, if you looked at any textbook in forensic science or criminalistics, you'd probably see something like this. Forensic science is the application of science to the law. And that could be a lot of things. Next slide. And from the perspective of, okay, we're actually missing a slide here, Steve, but that's okay. But then again, what is forensic science? Forensic science could be many things. We have people who are medical examiners who are considered forensic pathologists, where they're essentially diagnosing death. There we go. We have folks who are dentists who get engaged in forensic science through the use of dental records for identification purposes of skeletal remains. Forensic anthropologists are that group of anthropologists who gets involved with developing biological profiles of skeletal material to provide investigative leads. Forensic toxicologists are those individuals who analytically study poisons and drugs in human tissue and human body fluids. We have folks who get engaged in drug identification. And then there's this group called Criminalistics that we're all involved in, and this is our section of the academy. And I think things that fall into the category of criminalistics involve two things. One is linkage, and the other is individualization. The criminalistics was once called by Dr. Paul Kirk, who many consider to be the father of criminalistics, the science of individualization. And really, criminalistics is the only science that I can think of that's ultimate goal is to take a piece of physical evidence and try to ascertain, to the extent that is possible, the origin of a particular piece of evidence. So we try to attempt uniqueness. And there's many different areas of criminalistics. There's things that have a chemical nature, and there's things that are biological in origin. Okay, next slide. And then finally, what kind of background is needed in order to become a forensic scientist, which I'm sure is what most of the folks on this webinar tonight are interested in. And I'm going to start by looking at a document that was produced in 2004 by the National Institute of Justice that called Education and Training in Forensic Science, a guide for forensic science laboratories, educational institutions, and students. And they talk also certainly about the scientific backgrounds needed, but that they talk about other things that they feel make the model candidate. And certainly what you see on the slide here certainly rings true. The model candidate possesses personal integrity, holds at a minimum a bachelor's degree in the natural sciences, and has the following abilities. One is critical thinking. Well, that's what all scientists do. Obviously, being a scientist is being a critical thinker. And some other things that fall into the model candidate is the ability to do decision making, good laboratory practices, awareness of laboratory safety, observation and attention to detail, and certainly these days computer proficiency is part of this whole important scheme. Next slide. Interpersonal skills. You know, it's interesting. I teach both undergraduates and graduate students, and the undergraduates in particular somehow have this view that a forensic laboratory is a very interpersonal, not a very personal place, and it's not true. It's a very personal place. It's a very active place. You deal not only with fellow scientists, but you deal with attorneys, you deal with law enforcement personnel. And you need to be able to have the skills to be able to talk to a wide range of audience. Certainly public speaking is important. One of the things that we all do is we try to, you know, we have to be expert witnesses in court. And we have to know how to publicly speak, and we have to have good oral and written communication skills. We need time management skills, and we certainly need to be able to prioritize tasks. And I think given the caseload in many forensic laboratories now, this is actually a more critical skill than ever before. Next slide.
I interject here at the
Sure.
I just wanted to go back one step and consider that definition of a forensic scientist or forensic science. This is Dwight Adams speaking, formerly with the FBI laboratory. I like to stress to my students that the definition of forensic science really can and often does go beyond the application of science to the criminal justice system. And I'll give you two examples of that. First would be the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. many forensic scientists are being employed to identify or characterize improvised explosive devices from those wars. Secondly would be natural disasters, the typhoon in Philippines, the tsunamis in Japan and Thailand. Those natural disasters require forensic scientists to identify remains. And so when you think of forensic science, it can certainly be thought of in a broader context than simply the application of science to criminal justice or law. Thank you, Larry.
Okay.
Yeah, I would, this is Steve Lee, I would also add the thoughts that I'm sure many of our listeners are thinking about as well, that we can use forensic science in human rights investigations, in wars that have occurred, and it's now being applied internationally. Obviously, there's applications that are being done in the missing persons area, and of course the Innocence Project. So it really does have a very broad definition. I'm glad you brought that up, Dwight.
All right, next slide, Steve. I guess we can progress here. You know, in terms of academic qualifications, certainly one thing that's always needed is a strong background in all the natural sciences. And, you know, I'm going to say here, you know, minimum of a bachelor's degree, although I think it's becoming, at least in my experience, harder to get a position in forensic science with just a bachelor's degree. I think the master's degree, I think, is becoming kind of the de facto degree in forensic science. And I think that's something that's changing. I worked for 12 years at the New York City Medical Examiner's Office, and this is going back a decade now, and we stopped even considering anybody with just a bachelor's degree. So I think this is something that's probably changing, although most positions are listed saying that you need at least a minimum of a bachelor's degree. Next slide. In terms of the ideal curriculum, you know, if we look at undergraduate curriculum, and if we look at the standards as put forth by FEPAC, which is that group that accredits forensic science academic programs, at the very least, the undergraduate core would consist of, you know, biology with lab, physics with lab, general chemistry with lab, organic chemistry with lab, calculus, and statistics. Those are all things that FEPAC views as being part of that natural science core, and it is likely to be found in any good forensic science undergraduate program. Next slide, Steve. And then, of course, you have to build off that foundation by having specialized science courses, which certainly includes things like biochemistry, molecular biology, genetics, physical chemistry. Certainly not limited to this, and really depending on the academic program you're in, this could take a variety of different forms. And, you know, finally, those things that are forensic science courses. You know, what are some of the topics that are really important that would be common to any forensic science program? There would be things like courtroom testimony, introduction to law, quality assurance, ethics, professional practice, background requirements, evidence ID, and so on. And certainly most programs would offer, even those programs that specialize in a particular area, a survey of forensic science. And then you have those types of courses that speak specifically to different parts of criminalistics, such as forensic biology, forensic chemistry, physical methods, and microscopy are just some of the examples. Next slide. And of course, you know, the moral of the story is, you know, to study science. And in your first, you know, the way you think of a forensic scientist is that you are a scientist first and foremost. And all these things certainly apply to any education of a forensic scientist. Next slide. But certainly the other things are important as well: personal communication, written communication skills, oral communication skills. These are things that all have to be part of any forensic science academic program. Next slide. Go ahead, Steve. Okay. And again, you know, going back to the NIJ document, again, the personal characteristics that they view as certainly the most important are things like personal honesty, integrity, and certainly scientific objectivity. Next slide. Now I think we're going to start talking about, you know, going into that first job from your academic program. And one of the things that you can certainly count on is that there's going to be conditions of employment. And depending on the system you apply to or the job that you seek, these are some of the things that may be part of the conditions of employment. Certainly drug testing. Some places you have to undergo a polygraph examination. Some systems may have medical and physical examination, particularly those individuals who may get involved with crime scene work. The physical examination part is going to be important. Background checks, they, you know, depending on the system, could be very, very, very thorough and very complex, and may go back farther than you may actually realize. Next slide. And some of the things that are likely to come up in the typical background checks, they're going to be interested in any history of drug use. They're going to be interested in any criminal history. They're going to be interested in your personal associations. You know, the associations that you make are your choice. And, you know, some individuals are likely to judge your character by looking at the type of individuals you associate with. Driving record. Well, why is that up there? Well, I mean, you may have to drive to court, and if you have your suspended license, you may not be able to do that. Past work performance, credit history. You know, a lot of laboratories have, you know, storages of controlled substances, firearms, and, you know, they may think you might be at risk of theft if you have a poor credit history. And, you know, that.
Let me interject here just
Sure.
a moment. Again, this is Dwight Adams. I think it's important to point out at this stage, he's talking about employment, but you also need to consider pre-employment during your academic pursuits. For example, many programs around the country, many educational programs around the country require an internship. That internship will, in most instances, require a background investigation by the law enforcement agency where the internship is conducted. So these issues of drug use and criminal histories and other things may hit you well before you apply for a job, but rather when you apply for an internship. Thank you.
And then, you know, finally, the last thing here, I think things of like history of community service and outside activities could be a factor in whether or not you get a particular position. Okay, next slide, Steve. Getting that first job, where do you look? You know, websites from professional organizations, and we're going to give you a list toward the end of the presentation here on, you know, those professional organizations, and I think most of them probably have an employment page that I think is very important. Human resource pages from local and state governments, I think, are particularly important. Not every public sector agency advertises, say, on the American Academy of Forensic Sciences website. You may have to look specifically at human resource pages to find opportunities in forensic labs. USAjobs.com is a particularly good one for federal jobs. One thing that could be helpful is looking at science job recruiters. Labsupport.com is a good place to look for that first job. Now, these typically don't include forensic science-based opportunities, but they may provide you with the opportunity for employment in other scientific endeavors. Many forensic science jobs require a couple years of professional laboratory experience. Often it doesn't have to be within forensic science, and it might be helpful to look at these types of job recruiting websites for job recruiters that could help you land that first laboratory job that could ultimately lead to a forensic science job.
Larry, it might be a good time to pass the ball, because there's a number of slides that I have kind of on the whole career and job search idea. So are you able to pass the ball to me?
I thought that you already have the ball.
Oh, right. I am with the ball. I've forgotten. Right. Okay. So last fall we hosted a student workshop, and there were a number of folks that came and spoke, many of them from the CAC and Academy AAFS. Their names are listed here. And what we did, I think this was the first time that it was held, it was a student-centered workshop. And we were really focusing in on ideas on how to find jobs, what sorts of things you need to do to locate a job. And as Larry was saying, that it's a highly competitive field. And it went through some resume and cover letter things, which I'll jump in again after we start that section. So what I did was I kind of took some of the highlights from the workshop, and one thing that I know that all of us who are advising students have said is you have to do a lot of research in order to think about a career, and it's really an ongoing process. And this is from one of the documents that I'll provide in terms of a resource. Let's see if I can shrink this so you can see the whole thing. And it starts with asking questions about your own values and interests and what skills you have. Dr. John Tonkin was actually just on campus. He's with the Cal DOJ Missing Persons Database, and he was sharing with the students the idea that when he was thinking about a job, the first thing he was thinking was I really like lab work. I like sort of being at the bench, and that was one of the things that started him on his quest for a job in the crime lab. But as Larry was saying, there's this interpersonal aspect of things. You then start looking at the kinds of places and employers, and then, as Dwight mentioned, it's really important that you get some experience, and that can come from internships. Volunteering, a really key thing for our students has been, they might not get a job right away, but they can volunteer and go in there and get their hands wet, so to speak. It really helps them to define if this is really for them. And then once you do that, then you sort of start to make decisions, and you network with the folks in the areas. Again, you can be volunteering, and then we'll get into the whole idea of where you go with the cover letters and resumes and interviews to get the job. And then once you're in the job, there's a lot to do with where you're going, your relationships. Once you get the job, it's not over. I think I was told that the average person has eight different jobs in their lifetime. And if you were able to look at the slides that Larry put together from our own backgrounds, you'd see that we're from a number of different places. And then you go back to the idea of self-exploration, so it's an ongoing process. I'm going to skip a number of these slides because there's another section on recruiter resources, and the two folks that have actually come and spoken on campus here at San Jose are from Kelly Scientific and Lab Support. And so I just provide you with their emails. And one main thing about recruiters, and this was sort of like an aha moment for me, as Larry was saying, it's very competitive out there. How do you land your first forensic science job? And my students have frequently taken a path of getting a science job first. And so thinking about that, I used to work in the industry, and we would hire people through these recruiter agencies. And really some of the best parts of working with a recruiter are they're working for you. So they're actually interested in making your resume as attractive as possible. They will help you with the process of looking and interviewing. Sometimes they have access to jobs that aren't posted. And many companies are moving from temporary, it's kind of this honeymoon period for them, to actual full-time positions. So there are many more of those kinds of positions available. And then, these relationships that you end up with the recruiters, they end up then seeking you out when there are jobs available. And it's all free. So that's the other aspect of things too. The candidates looking for a job, you provide them with a resume. They generally bring you in and interview you to see, sort of doing some of that self-exploration that I showed on the first slide. And then they place you in these various interviews, and your success is their success. So it was something that, as I said, was an aha moment for me. Students can then utilize these recruiters and end up with some resources to actually land the jobs. Okay, I'm done. I realize I have the ball now.
Okay. All right. Next slide, I guess. We're good. All right. Some of the keys, and Steve talked a little bit about resume and cover letter. Certainly, you want to accentuate the positive. Be cognizant of keywords. If job description says DNA analysis, use the term in either the resume or cover letter. A lot of these types of positions are going to get hundreds of resumes, hundreds of cover letters, and they're likely to be scanned, and they're going to look specifically for certain words that are going to perhaps make your resume stand out a little. And it might be a way of getting your resume noticed through at least the initial screen. I think it's absolutely critically important that the cover letter is grammatically correct. I know plenty of employers, if the cover letter is not grammatically correct, the resume doesn't even get looked at. It's absolutely critical, and one of the things that employers across the board now say, their biggest problem is finding candidates who have good writing skills. And if you have, like I mentioned before, that is I think one of the really important skills. In the cover letter, you might want to state reasons why they should hire you, but be concise and to the point. I think that most people probably get bored after three paragraphs or so, particularly if it's an entry-level position.
Yeah, and I'm going to again grab the chance to show you a few other things from the workshop. I think that sometimes we assume that our students are going to do the research on the organization, but it's so important that you know about the place and what their mission is, and the range of the sorts of services they provide. And really, you know, as Larry was pointing out, you want to, in both the cover letter and your resume, think about how it projects how you're going to be an asset to the agency. The more you know about the agency or biotech company or place that you're applying to, the better it's going to be for both, you know, getting your resume and cover letter together. As Larry said, you know, it should basically answer the question, why should I, the person who's looking at your resume, hire you? And moreover, the resume is just the step to the interview. Give them a reason why they should meet with you. As Larry was saying, keep it simple. Make sure it's both grammatically correct and there's, you know, spelling and punctuation is all correct. Have somebody read it. Have a number of folks take your resume and your cover letter and actually look it over. And place the most important information at the top. This is all from Mary Juneau, who puts on a resume and cover letter workshop at San Jose State for our forensic science students. It's better not to just send out one generic resume for every job. If you can genuinely alter the resume to fit the job and the cover letter especially. I won't go through this. Just a few slides on the cover letter. You know, I have seen this happen as well. People will write, "Oh, my life would be so great if I could have this job." What they want to know is why they should offer you an interview to have the job. All you really need to do is make yourself sound like the right person for the job. And so again, it's who should the letter be addressed to? And I was actually just talking to a colleague of mine who was filling out even an email back to the job person at the person in charge of hiring, and I said, well, how did they sign their letter out to everybody? And it was PhD. And I said, well, you have to address them then with their name and the PhD, or dear Dr. So-and-so. It's very important to address a person with the correct title. You know, downstream they may say, hey, you don't have to call me doctor. It'd be fine if you just call me Steve or Larry. And it's the familiar, you know, when you become familiar, then you can do that. And then never write a generic to whom it may concerns type letter. You know, speak about the organization in your letter so they know that you've done the research there, and briefly summarize your education, your professional experience, and the important personal qualities you bring to the job. And finally, you know, tell them that you'd like to meet them, provide all the contact information they need, and this is another thing that I think fits in this section as well, Larry. I have seen applications filled out incompletely, again with, you know, errors in spelling and punctuation, or with handwriting I can't read. So make sure that you fill the application out correctly, and again, have it looked over by some professionals in the field. Okay.
All right. So let's talk about the interview. And this first point here is kind of a fine line. You want to be confident, but not overzealous. And having some experience with being interviewed is likely to give you some idea. And one of the things I have on the next slide here is find opportunities to practice the interview. Can you just back up again, Steve? I'm sorry. Can you back up? Ah, there we go. Right. Okay. and really having, finding it, and maybe your academic programs do this. We certainly do this in ours. We are very curious at how our students interview, which often becomes what you find out. It's often very different than how you may think that they might do. And a lot of it is that the fact they may come across as overzealous. You want to be confident, but not overzealous. And you really need to be professional. Next slide. And by professionalism, the way that, I always like to define it is what others think, not what you think. If you ask students, what is professionalism, they'll start saying that it's the way I dress, it's the way I look, it's the way I speak, which of course is all true, but ultimately it is the impression that you make to the person or people doing the interviewing. Next slide. And your first impression is really important. Obviously, I think you're looking at a suit. Now, these are just kind of guidelines, and there might be other colors that may look appropriate given, the type of attire. But, I think you're safe with black, gray, or navy blue. If you have piercings, I think they should be removed, except maybe the lobe of an ear for a woman. I know several employers that have told me that it's not something that I think they feel comfortable with talking to people on the interview about, but I know several people who have interviewed folks who've come in with piercing and, for that matter, tattoos visible, and they simply didn't get the job because they did not come across to them as professional. Another good rule of thumb is no cologne or perfume. Your speech is really important. Speak in complete sentences. No lazy speech, for instance, losing the G in words ending with ing. And no filler words or colloquialisms. Try to keep the ums to a minimum, for instance. And a lot of this really comes about when I talked about before about oral and communication skills and practicing and having the opportunity to speak publicly. I think if you have more of an opportunity to do that, I think it'll translate over to the interview process. Next slide. And again, look for ways to practice interviewing. Certainly I would ask, if your academic program doesn't do this, I would certainly speak to the director and see if there's something that could be done, because I do think there's a real art to interviewing. We've all had experiences where we were surprised that the person who interviewed got that particular position over other people who we thought would have gotten that position. And a lot of it really comes down to that first impression, those precious few moments during that interview, which particularly if you're a new person in the field, this is your first job, the interview is absolutely critical. Next slide. Okay.
So, Larry, I have a couple of slides from the workshop on this as well. So this gentleman, Alex Calder, was somebody that I met back when I was at the Cal DOJ, and it reiterates a lot of what you've said, but coming from a different perspective, which was quite unique when he introduced me to his thoughts on interviewing. The first aspect are things that I think we all have thought of. Listening and taking notes and referring back to them. I think this is something that as you're talking to somebody, or even when you're in a science lecture, or even just some other kind of meeting, it's really critical that you demonstrate that you're actually listening. It's really sort of a deal breaker when you're providing some critical information, if it's during the interview, and then the candidate says, you said this before, but I really didn't listen, and can you repeat that for me? So listening skills are really critical. Something that Alex had mentioned at the workshop for the students is be prepared to ask your questions. And I know that that's something that we all advise our students about, during, as Larry was mentioning, during these mock interviews. You want to be able to articulate meaningful questions based on the research that you've done for the organization. But he even goes beyond that. He has some questions which really provide the hiring representatives an idea that they really want to hire you. And I'll show you the things that he has in his slides, just a couple of slides. The ones that come up a lot are, what are your weaknesses? Why should we hire you? And really one of the things that I've been told is that it's not necessarily the best qualified candidate that gets the job. Certainly if the hiring agency is doing a good job, they're going to get the cream of the crop, but it's actually the best interviewee that gets the job. So it really can't be stressed how important it is. So here's the thing that this is I think the last slide from Alex. He provides this tool, or just a set of tools, and he's actually written a book on interviewing, in where you walk into the interview and you ask if it would be okay to take a little bit of time to ask some questions of the people who are interviewing you. So they generally will have at the end of the interview, do you have any questions for us? So they have set aside at least a little bit of time to allow you to ask questions. And it's an opening to ask questions that he suggests provide them the idea that you're going to succeed at the job. So if you see this on the fourth bullet here, the first question that he asks, given the opportunity and permission from the hiring group, is, if it was my first day on the job, what would you tell me I should do correctly from day one to make sure I'm successful at meeting all the expectations for the position? So that way you're clarifying success, and in fact he's mentioned that it would be exceeding the expectations, as the follow-up question to that. And usually the hiring folks are not ready, they're kind of surprised at that question. They're just thinking, well, we want somebody that meets our expectations. They're not expecting a question on how you would exceed their expectation. It already gives them the idea that you're thinking about success. And then the last question that he's provides, and you, as he suggests to the students, you need to sort of word these in an authentic way. That's your question. Which members of the team will I interact with, and what things can I do to support them in their roles? So again, it provides them the idea that you're going to be a team player. So the bottom line with his approach is that the questions that you ask say more about you than the answers that you provide in the interview itself.
I've got one thing to add as well, Steve.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the one thing that I would like to add to this discussion is I like to call it the elevator speech. I believe going into an interview, you should have that 30-second speech, that the time it takes you to go from the first floor to the 12th floor in an elevator, to be able to answer the question, why should we hire you? And that elevator speech is probably going to come out at the very end when they ask, is there anything else you would like to say about yourself or why we should hire you? And it should be that last statement that everyone on the panel has in their mind about you. Let me give you an example. I was being interviewed for the FBI laboratory director's position. I was the only internal candidate to the FBI. All the other candidates were external to the FBI. And I was being interviewed by the FBI director. And and I had the opportunity to give him my elevator speech, and it went something like this. There may be a lot of other very smart scientists that have applied for this job, but I can guarantee you that none of them have the passion for this agency or this position that I do. That's what was left in his mind when he was through with my interview. So I would suggest to you, have that kind of speech ready for these interviews.
Yes, that's an excellent point, that you want to be prepared to leave them with that really strong impression, and as Larry had pointed out, to be clear and concise as well with the statement. The last thing I'll say about interviewing, and it comes a little bit from my own personal experience. My first interview was actually out of my postdoc, was at a job that I really didn't think I had an interest in taking, but I went anyway. And I was so relaxed that they offered me the job right after my interview. And you know, I think that a part of the reason why I was asking them questions that were very honest and open, and they saw that I was, you know, continuing to learn about what my qualifications were and which ones that I could improve on. And what Alex has in this last question is use the interview as an opportunity to strengthen both your interview skills and your, as Dwight said, your elevator speech. What qualifications do you wish were stronger, you know, during this interview process? So it's a really important way to improve as you go through the process of, you know, finding a job and interviewing.
Next slide, Steve. Now, one thing I just wanted to end with is about interviewing is to be aware of your social media. They're going to look on your Facebook page, and then I do know several instances where employers or forensic labs for government laboratories who have asked people on the interview to provide them with access to the Facebook page, because they want to see what's on there. And again, they're going to make some sort of judgment based on what they may find. And you have to be careful of what it is that is on your Facebook page in particular. So I do think that's something that if you're not aware of, certainly be careful with. I wanted to talk a little bit about forensic laboratories in general. We want to speak about forensic laboratories in general, and I do think prior to all the TV shows, I think you had this massive growth, particularly at the state levels, where many states were beginning to develop forensic laboratories that most of us who've been in the field for a while could have hardly imagined just years before. And I think it's because I think, you know, DNA led the revolution. I think DNA put forensic science on the front page. I think DNA put forensic science as the first line of defense in a criminal prosecution. And I think it's because of that success that you had this massive influx of resources at the state level, in particular, to developing forensic labs. And I think this is what ultimately led the popular culture to get involved, and what has led many young people eventually to get involved or get interested in forensic science. Next slide, Steve. This is from an older source now. It's about 8 years old, from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And I think this number is probably a little bit higher than what you see in front of you. But as of 2005, there were 389 publicly funded forensic labs in the U.S. Most of them were state or regional labs, but you certainly have county labs, municipal labs, and federal labs in which there's many opportunities for employment. Next slide. Again, going back to this 2005 survey, they estimated there were 11,900 full-time personnel in forensic labs. Most of those are scientists, some were technicians, some managerial, probably many of which were what you would see at some point in the scientist category, clerical, and also some crime scene technicians. The medium lab size is about 16. I've seen forensic labs with one person, and my own lab in New York now has over 300. So there's a big range, but the medium lab size was 16, and 62% of labs send scientists to crime scene. I think that's pretty much a jurisdictionally determined. When I was in New York, forensic lab personnel went to crime scene all the time. Where Steve is in California, there's a long history of that. Where I'm now in Pennsylvania, it hardly ever happens. But at least according to this study here, 62% of labs do send scientists to crime scenes.
Yeah, I would say that I know some labs where Contra Costa County Crime Lab had for the longest time the requirement that the forensic scientist was actually sworn and went to their own scenes and collected their own evidence. And as you said, you know, for your experience now, it's much less common. I would say that on major sorts of crimes and complex crimes, the analysts are sent out, but it's not a routine part of their job.
Okay, next slide, Steve. And again, in the public sector, there's local laboratories, which are all county labs, and large municipalities like New York and Chicago, Los Angeles have their own laboratories. Every state has a system, even with some smaller states that maybe just one lab. I believe like Iowa, for instance, is one laboratory. And then you have the federal labs, which include things like the FBI lab and the Customs Laboratory. But I think more and more there's opportunities in the private sector, particularly in the areas of DNA and toxicology. There's a lot of opportunities for employment. And there's some examples there. CellMart has been one that's been around for a long time, and I'm finding that a lot of my students are getting hired in private sector forensic laboratories in a way that they didn't even a few years ago. Next slide. This picture here, of course, is the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, that Dwight, I'm sure, is very familiar with. But there are also several other examples of forensic labs on the federal level. The DEA is a laboratory that routinely hires. We've been very fortunate to have several of our students get hired with that group. But there are other opportunities in those labs that you see listed there before you. Next slide. This is just a picture of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Lab, and I believe it's in Oregon. I believe it's near Portland. And this is another great facility too, and just another opportunity. You know, I point this out because not every federal lab may be in the Washington D.C. metro area. And here's an example. Next slide. These are pictures of relatively. I just lost the slide there, Steve. I'm sorry.
Oh, is it your computer? I still have it up.
Yeah, I think something happened. Okay, there it is. I'm sorry. These are just pictures of two relatively new systems. This is the Oregon system and the Minnesota system. And this, I think, shows the expansion of forensic laboratory services, particularly on the state level. When I first started working in a forensic laboratory in New Jersey, the laboratory that we thought was state-of-the-art, and this is going back to the mid-1980s, what we thought was state-of-the-art certainly would maybe encompass a half of a floor of some of these laboratories today. And this is the sort of thing that you find in several states. And I think it shows the commitment that many states have given toward forensic services. Next slide.
So before I know that the organizations are next, I thought I would show something that the recruiter actually provided to the group, which I was really impressed with. So one of the things that you were just talking about are the number of labs and the places where folks might look for jobs, and they're able to through their huge network of database access, look for various keywords and just, sort of look at trends. And this was generated right before the workshop back in 2012. But there's just 2 pages in this report I want to show you. One is on the educational level, so you can see the kinds of things that they actually provide in this kind of report. It's what it was focused on California, but it actually has state reports and cities and the educational level, the salary compensation and that kind of thing. And so you can see that they really did get some of the jobs posted likely in the areas that we would normally look. I know we're going to talk about that later on. But on page 8 is a educational level and experience. And in California, at least up until the end of last year, there were still a fair number of jobs that were advertised for the bachelor's degree. Now, what Larry was mentioning is that it's become very competitive, and the folks who are applying really have to have the additional experience in order to be competitive in that way. And then, it shows sort of years of experience of job seekers, because the database goes both ways. They have both the jobs that are listed and then the candidates that are posting their information. And then this was the last thing I wanted to show you that was very interesting. They're able to, very quickly look geographically over the entire United States as to where the jobs over the last 2 years have been coming up. So this was kind of a very nice report that, again, I think the recruiters, I had mentioned this to both panelists earlier on, that we've been kind of fortunate that one of our forensic science graduates is now a recruiter with one of these places, and we're able to sort of take advantage of that with our graduating students. So they have access to information like this that can be very helpful for people looking for jobs that way.
Next slide. Forensic organizations. There are, I forget the number, but there is a great deal many than what's up on the screen here. And many of these represent the kinds of organizations that forensic scientists join. Now, this event is sponsored by the American Academy of Forensic Scientists, which is Forensic Sciences, I'm sorry, which is the largest forensic science organization in the world. But there are several regional forensic science societies as well. Steve is a member of the California Association of Criminalists. I'm actually president-elect of the Northeastern Association of Forensic Scientists, and I think there's certainly a role for the regional organization, and particularly these tend to be good meetings for students. particularly students who are getting used to perhaps presenting original research, at professional conferences. There's the International Association for Identification, and those are a lot of crime scene folks and a lot of folks that deal with pattern evidence. A very important group that I like to point out is the American Board of Criminalistics, which is that body that certifies criminalists. And they offer certifications in areas such as forensic molecular biology and forensic drug chemistry, and certainly with the recommendations from the National Academy of Sciences report that came out a few years ago, it certainly looks like certification is going to play a larger role in the profession. And certainly in the last 2 years, I believe that the amount of people who have become ABC certified has in fact close to doubled. And you have one state that I know, North Carolina, now mandates certification for scientists, and if and I know there's legislation pending in a couple other states as well. But essentially in North Carolina is if you're hired in the lab system there, you're going to have a certain amount of time to become certified through the ABC. And I know in the Northeast there were several lab directors who were trying to put that as part of a job specification as well. So that's a group that I think you really have to know about, and certainly something that I think certification is certainly coming, if it hasn't already, if you will. Scientific working groups are those groups that develop best practices, recommendations in different areas. Steve, for instance, was a member of the scientific working group for DNA analysis and methods, and they get, they're very concerned with things such as quality assurance in DNA, and there are other groups as well in trace evidence exam and drug chemistry that make these kinds of recommendations. And there's certainly the type of groups that you should be, as students, aware of, and certainly aware of the recommendations that they make to the community. Next slide. And I think as a future professional, even if you're a young professional, I think it's important for the forensic science community for you to be involved, to join these organizations. I think every person in forensic science, every professional has a stake in the profession. And I think joining these organizations is a way of developing a sense of community, and I think it's something that I think can help drive you forward as a professional. There's a lot of information that's given out at these meetings, not only in ways of new research, but also in terms of public policy matters that get discussed. And I also think it's certainly important to know the history of forensic science. Unfortunately, I think a lot of this has been lost on the community. I think a lot of the history of forensic science has been written down, but I think it goes to this notion of providing a sense of community for particularly the new practitioner. You also have an obligation to continue your education. If it's not through a formal academic program, certainly I think you have an obligation as a young professional to continue to professionally develop. A lot of professional organizations offer workshops. The American Academy of Forensic Sciences offers workshops. Several academic institutions offer continuing education workshops for professionals. The NIJ, the National Institute of Justice, offers training, and this is we're going to show you some web links in a few minutes. But there is the website that lists all the training that's sponsored by NIJ, and I believe that most of that is free for people who are actually working in public sector laboratories. But I think it's important as a young professional to always keep moving forward And one way to do that is through continuing education opportunities. Next slide, Steve. One thing that's important, and again, this was something that was pointed out by the National Academy of Sciences recommendation for the future of forensic science, is they said that one thing that the profession lacks is a uniform code of ethics. And I think that's probably correct. And there are all these professional organizations have professional codes of ethics, and they really do serve as a good guide of professional behavior. In my view, I think the code of ethics that has been put together by the California Association of Criminalists is probably the best model out there, but it does provide guidance to the type of gray areas that often a forensic scientist is faced with. And a code of ethics is so much more than telling you that you shouldn't falsify your results. Right? We all know that that's wrong. But there's always gray areas that you're faced with. And I don't think we do enough, in my view, as a community to look at these professional codes of ethics as ways of kind of providing guidance to how you should act in particular situations. Next slide. Next slide, Steve. Okay, and this is something that Steve had pointed out to us when we talked as a group. On the California Association of Criminalists website, and that's hyperlinked there into the PowerPoint. And this survey was put together by a member of the organization, Carolyn Gannett. And what she does is she looks at all the codes that are out there, and she kind of summarizes them. And she has concepts, what does, for instance, what do they say about methodology, and then she'll go through and she'll actually look at which codes of ethics actually address it. And what I find interesting about these charts is that there does appear to be a lot of overlap, but there also appears to be things that are fairly distinctive to each of the codes. Now, Steve, do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, I think that they're quite varied. In fact, if you look across, I know it's hard to read all of these things, but Carolyn Gannett actually was a person that put this all together. And what's here is basically sort of the category of the area that the specific language addresses. So the first one is be objective. And across the top here in the various columns are mainly forensic science organizations, but also any other science organizations have been included. So I guess if you would imagine this for a moment, in the perfect world, you would have essentially all of these things would somehow be addressed. And these subcategories then in yellow represent be objective in analysis, and be objective in the next section in report writing, be objective in conflicts of interest. And so in the perfect world, you'd expect in a column that you would have each one of those areas addressed. And so by just looking at a glance, what you see is that there's a lot of variety in what the codes address, depending on which organization is, code you're looking at. And as you had mentioned, CAC has a pretty extensive code and addresses many of them, but not all. And so, I think one of the nice things about this is you can look at where you are and what organizations you're a part of because you're held to that code of ethics, and look to the other ones. Just because you're not held to the other ones doesn't mean that it's not important to consider those other areas. So it's kind of a nice grid that allows users to both look at the language and then in our own training, we've had Carolyn come where she does scenarios and poses real life scenarios that then people actually have to think about. You know, how would you deal with a specific ethics violation in your own organization? What areas of the code that you adhere by would this violate? So it's a very, very important topic, and she makes it, you know, real and actually interactive.
Next slide, Steve. I guess we could just go to the end here. We can advance one. We do have some links here and some suggestions. The first is, I do think as young professionals, I think it's important that you start building your library. And these are some recommendations. Now, it's interesting that I just noticed that we list the Saperstein Forensic Science Handbooks, Volume 2 and 3, but certainly the second edition of the first volume, I think, is particularly important. But these are just some suggestions for things that we think are pretty important.
And also something that I know that we've talked about in the past that I don't think made it in the slides is that ABC actually has a reading list that they publish.
That's right. And there are just this is just some books in the forensic DNA area, and then we have several web links, and all the regional organizations are listed on these web links, as well as some other groups that I think are important. Like American Society of Trace Evidence Examiners is a particularly good website for those people who are interested in trace evidence. In fact, they have their own journal that I think is actually quite good. And there's some other resources there as well for other groups, and also some topics. For instance, the Innocent Project's their uses of DNA and exonerating the innocent. And there are different topic areas like fingerprints and firearms, and I think pretty much all the SWIG groups, the scientific working groups, have their own websites as well. And these are all good resources for the young professional. Many of these things are linked to larger websites. You know, Zeno's forensic page, for instance, will have most of these actually linked to that site. And a lot of the professional organizations as well are going to have a lot of these links. But these are just some suggestions that we think could be that you would find of interest and are of importance. And, you know, I just want to close this portion of the webinar by saying, you know, regardless of what you do in forensic science, whether you work at the crime scene, you work in the laboratory, we all have a lot of things in common. And again, just going on the ethics things, you know, ethics is something that's going to be common to all forensic scientists. And there's certainly more things that bind us together than separate us. All right, so I guess we're at the point of the evening where we can begin to take questions from the attendees.
Yes. So we've been receiving some questions. Barry and I have been answering them, and I've been trying to send them off to you as well. But we have a question here. As a forensic scientist, for 12 years of experiences, they're interested in taking a certification with ABC, but are unable to get any feedback about the testing schedule. Do you have any advice that you could offer them?
Yes, my advice would be is if you go on the website for ABC, which I think I have it listed in the web link there. You simply have to email the registrar for the ABC and simply ask him for a schedule. And I think you would find, depending on what part of the country you're in, most of the regional organizations, in fact now all of them, actually participate in the ABC. And they are typically, those exams are typically given at the annual meeting of the regional organization. It's also given as well at the annual meeting of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. So if you could just find, if you go down, let's see if we can find the registrar's email address somewhere. Maybe on, and there is a link there that says offerings. Steve, if you could just kind of highlight that.
Here's the registrar.
Okay. Yeah, ABC registrar at Verizon.net. His name is Mike Healy. He's a criminalist in Florida, and he can certainly tell you where an offering is going to be held near you and when. But there are several places throughout the year. In fact, if you work for an agency that has several people interested in taking the exam, your laboratory could actually host the examination. But that's all information that Mike can give you. But you shouldn't have difficulty finding a test site location.
Great, thank you. I have another question here is related to this. Is do you have to be employed to become certified?
You know, I mean, this has changed. I think we have to look at this for a second. There is diplomate, there's fellow, and can you just scroll down there, Steve? I just want to see that. Because there used to be another category. Okay. Yeah. Oh, an affiliate. Yes. I'm not. I think that the affiliate category. Well, this is not, affiliates are not I think if you are not employed, and I would ask you to read this to make sure what the information I'm giving you is correct, is that you can take an affiliate, you could take an examination and qualify if you pass as an affiliate, and once you become employed, you would then be elevated to the diplomate status. But by and large, it is a it's a certification for professional proficiency. So ultimately, you do have to become employed. So what it says there is where Steve has his cursor is affiliates are certification eligible. So I think you could take the exam actually while you're a student, and then if you pass, I think you can become eligible to become a diplomate.
Great. I have another question here from Hannah Hansen. What are the different areas that you could possibly be working in as a criminalistics? For example, I know that some people only do DNA or trace evidence or blood spatter. Could you give a couple examples? And then also, what areas would you recommend for a chemistry major?
So
I mean,
I just scrolled to the American Academy website, and on the AAFS.org website, they have a section for students and choosing a career. And as you were asking that question, that was sort of the first place that I thought of, because on this site it actually talks about all of these different sections that are in the academy, and I think Larry mentioned several of these in his initial slides. But it goes into great depth in these different areas on the sorts of things that folks might do in these different areas, and you can then click on the link and actually look at the scope of the work and the kinds of skills that folks would need. It's a really very nice site for an introduction. The only caveat I have about it, and I don't know if Larry or Dwight have utilized this as well, is I think the salary information may be dated. But in any event, it's a very nice, you can see here, I'll scroll this away. I don't know if you're seeing my whole screen. But you can actually click on any of these different sections, and yeah, this thing I think was dated the last time I looked at it. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question?
The second thing was, I think that the question was, what do they recommend for somebody who I guess is majoring in chemistry? I mean, my view on this and is that one of the things you have to realize is that there is going to be job-specific standards. If you are to work in a forensic DNA lab, it's pretty well mandated that you're going to need coursework in biochemistry, genetics, molecular biology, and statistics. You know, and I know if you're going to be a drug chemist with the DEA that there's a certain number of chemistry credits that are required. But I think besides those kinds of things, I think that any natural science degree is a good foundation for a career in anything that you're interested in forensic science. I'll give you an example. I have a lot of our students, a lot of my own students who, and we have a fairly broad program. I don't have tracks in forensic biology or forensic chemistry or anything like that. But a lot of our students who are more of the chemistry types will say, well, they hate everything about DNA, for instance. And then I remind them that DNA is an organic molecule and that you can never get away from the chemistry. And I think that a chemistry degree is a great preparation for really any type of endeavor that one is interested in forensic science. That's just my view.
Yeah, I think that in the earlier part of the webinar, what Larry was saying is, you know, you are a scientist first, and certainly there are coursework requirements for various positions. But a good example of this is one of our first graduates from our program studied forensic biology, but is now working in the Controlled Substances Unit at Oakland Police Department Crime Lab. And so, you know, your background educationally is very important, but some of those qualities and courses that you're going to have in any subdiscipline are going to prepare you because they're preparing you to do detailed critical thinking, you know, scientifically using the scientific method. You're doing research or internships, and it allows you then to have a certain degree of mobility in terms of what area you go into, because really it's been my experience that students go from an academic program into essentially a training program in their first jobs. So although their background can be very helpful in preparing them for that training, generally you're going to go through a whole internal laboratory training plan and go through internal proficiency tests. So your interest in chemistry, I think you have a lot of choices there. I don't think I'm incorrect in saying that probably the highest number of cases in laboratories being put out are in the controlled substances and toxicology areas. Is that your impression too, Larry?
Yeah, absolutely. What's interesting about I think working in a controlled substances laboratory today is that I started my career working in that area, and at the time, most of it was crack cocaine. But I do think because of things like synthetic cannabinoids and cathinones and things of that nature, I think there's almost a greater need for people with real solid chemistry backgrounds to work in those areas now.
Great. So I have another question here. As a third-year student and next year, I will have the choice between taking an internship or writing a thesis. Which do you think would be more beneficial?
Well, we may have different views on this, but this is just my view. And I'd be interested to hear what Dwight and Steve say. I'll fall on the side of the thesis. I think that there is no better way of teaching scientists or creating a scientist than through research. I think internships are beneficial. I do, but I think that the research experience is, in my view, the thing that creates scientists, and some of those things that we mentioned in the PowerPoint about critical thinking and decision making. I think really research really plays well into that, and I would um, certainly go with the research aspect over the internship.
My opinion would be opposite of what Larry just said, and only from this standpoint. I totally agree with what he just said. And if you can do both, by all means, do both. But I look at my former career in the FBI and the interns that we had coming in, and we were able to choose our next employees from those interns. And that's what a lot of agencies do. And so the internship provides you with practical experience, laboratory-based experience, and sometimes they can lead to actual careers. And so from that perspective, I wouldn't want to dismiss the opportunity to do an internship.
Yeah, I would agree with everything both of the panelists have said, and would encourage you to try to do both. Not
Right.
necessarily at the same time. There is a program I've just brought up on my screen called Research Experiences for Undergraduates, and they have summer research experiences available. And it is a competitive program, but they're all over the country. And you can actually go and search the site for various kinds of research opportunities. And though it's somewhat less common to have forensic research, we actually have one at San Jose State. And if you're interested in chemistry, you can certainly do a chemistry research paid internships that are available, as I said, around the nation. And so if we click on biological sciences, for example, you can actually look at all the different places that have these paid research internships. And I call them internships too, because for my particular site, we actually have one that occurs at the university and one that occurs at the Santa Clara County Crime Lab. So they are really excellent opportunities to get some research in. And I know at the master's level there are some programs, at least not related to NSF, but Marshall University had some support at one point to have research being done where there was a collaboration between their master's program and crime labs, where they actually were able to place folks in various crime labs to do that part of their research, which led to a thesis. So it's kind of a combination. I'm sorry,
another opportunity is the U.S. Department of Energy has a summer undergraduate research experience, and there is a group out at the Ames Laboratory, which is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy at Iowa State University. They actually have scientists there that are engaged in forensic science research. And it's a great opportunity. We've had the good fortune of being able to send several of our undergraduates there. And it's a pretty good deal for the student. They have, they get a stipend, they get room and board. And every one of our students who we've sent there thought it was an absolutely fabulous experience.
Great. So here's another one.
I wanted to back up just a minute and okay.
No, go ahead, Steve.
Oh, I was just going to say that the question about what would you want to do with a chemistry forensics degree, you can sort of scroll through the SWIG pages, and you'll see that there are all sorts of areas that might a person with a chemistry background, might clearly contribute to, fire and explosive scenes, the geological materials, analysis of seized drugs. So what's nice about these sites, as Larry had mentioned, forensic toxicology, is that they provide, generally each SWIG has a part of their documents or a whole document dedicated to the training and educational background that they're looking for.
Great, thanks, Steve. So here's another question. From Hannah Hansen. I'm majoring in chemistry with a double minor in criminal justice and Spanish. Is this a good path for wanting a job in criminalistics?
So what is the person majoring in?
Majoring in chemistry.
Well, I mean, I think that's the key there, and I think certainly the other things. I mean, I think criminal justice is not going to hurt you in getting a job, and I think the key there is that you're going to have a degree in a natural science. And again, I think chemistry is just a great degree to have to begin a career in forensic science.
Hey, Jennifer Lewis would like to know, as a student in forensic studies, criminalistics to graduate program, I'm curious if being a volunteer at a local police department criminalistics unit might one day help me obtain employment in forensics.
Well, I don't think it can hurt, that's for sure. I mean, and again, I think a lot of it really is going to come down to the quality, I think, of the internship. And, certainly as Dwight was pointing out before, it may be helpful for that particular agency, particularly if you do a good job. But I think the experience factor alone, and again, when we talked about all the sorts of things that can be considered when trying to sort through the hundreds or so of resumes, I think that anything you have in that regard is probably, I'd say, a good thing.
And I'll add to that by pointing out the State Crime Laboratory here in Oklahoma that's located directly across the street from the Forensic Science Institute on my campus. Will say to our students, number one, do an internship with us, and number two, volunteer with us. and either or both of those will do nothing but help you actually get a job. That is, if you perform.
Great, thank you.
So just a couple of quick follow-ups. There are several different articles and information about educational backgrounds, and as Larry had pointed out, and then Dwight as well, having a BS in chemistry is a really good thing, and having an internship is another really critical factor. And then the other resource that I pulled up just now is from this series of resources that I had put together for the workshop. And I'll just point out that many of these come from just common journals that people have access to: the New York Times, Money Magazine, Forbes Magazine. This one is on how to prepare for an internship, and actually has some nice tips on, you know, things that you can do. Sorry, in terms of where you would go, learning your industry by reading the publications that are related to our field, and then sort of getting out there and making sure that you're, you have the right kind of networking skills as well. My students have been very successful because they take advantage of all the events that happen on campus. We have a annual forensic science seminar series where we bring on campus at least once every 2 months a speaker who's out in the field doing active work or research, and so we usually host them for lunch or dinner. I wish I could say the university pays for it, but in essence we get to pick their brains, and they then end up providing either more contacts for additional opportunities for research and internships, or they themselves become hosts for internships for students. So one of the messages in one of the talks that I didn't get to summarize was, take every opportunity that you have to go to those conferences, go to those meetings, go to those seminars, go to the social event where you know that it'll be attended by 20, 30, 40 lab directors or folks in the field. Volunteer at those places, because it allows you then to sort of open up many doors that may otherwise stay closed.
Great. I have another one here. It's kind of a summary of 3 or 4 questions, but could you speak some to the advantages of pursuing a Master's of Science or a PhD? A lot of this has been focused on a bachelor's degree.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead, Dwight.
Well, I was going to just say that I think Larry mentioned very succinctly that it is a competitive field, and that competition is forcing students to go on beyond the bachelor's degree. If you look at our students coming out of this program in Oklahoma, the students with a master's degree, 93% are in their field of choice now. Yet the same can't be said of those with just a bachelor's degree. So I think it makes perfectly good sense to move on. However, I will tell students, try to get that job once you have your bachelor's degree, because oftentimes an agency may pay for you to get an advanced degree and let them pay for it. On the other hand, if you can't get a job, then go on for that master's degree yourself.
Yeah, and again, we have similar numbers at Cedar Crest that Dwight has seen at Central Oklahoma. our masters and we graduate about seven or eight master's candidates a year. They tend to get jobs before they graduate, which is certainly not the case. Well, it's certainly not seen at the undergraduate level. And I also think, and this is again my own view, I think the more education that you have, I think the more marketable you will be, not only for that next job, but down the line. I think if you have the opportunity to get a PhD, if you get accepted to a doctoral program in science that's likely to provide you with a stipend and free tuition, I think you take the opportunity. I think that may provide down the road perhaps an opportunity to become a lab director, for instance. I think, in my view, is that you try to get as much education as you can as early as you can.
Yeah, I know several people have had the same experience as I did. It was just what Dwight was saying. I went, after I got done with my bachelor's degree, I went to a job in actually molecular pharmacology. And at the job, they paid for my master's degree. And so it was kind of like having a little bit of the best of both worlds. And I think that, it's not for everybody. I also agree that having as much education is going to make it easier for you to look for a position. And certainly for many of the technical lead positions for laboratories, they will require an advanced degree. So, there were several discussions back when I was on TwigDam, which became SwigDam, which I'm no longer a part of. But when we were discussing the educational requirements for the technical lead, those ideas of PhD came up, and so I think that it's a trend that's going on. I think that there are many jobs out there for folks with bachelor's degrees, but if you have the opportunity to go to graduate school, I agree with Larry and Dwight that take it. And certainly if you get a chance to have the agency or the group pay for it, you'd be surprised at how many of those places do pay at least some of the costs of your continuing education.
Great. I'm going to have one more question here before we close out tonight. With looking for undergraduate and graduate programs, how important is FEPAC accreditation?
Well, I'm probably a little bit biased here because I'm a former chair of FEPAC and I spent 6 years as a commissioner. I will tell you that I think it's becoming more important. But I don't think we're quite all the way there yet. I do think, and I do know anecdotally of some agencies that look for graduates of FEPAC accredited programs, although I don't think that is something that's universal. But I think it's headed in that direction. I do think, whereas probably 30 years ago, the idea about laboratory accreditation, forensic laboratories, was somewhat of a novel thing. Now it's certainly the norm. I think the same thing is going to happen with academic programs. We have a FEPAC accredited program, and I certainly, think it's something that academic programs should try to achieve. And I do recommend that to students who are looking for academic programs.
I would agree with Larry that FEPAC accreditation is important, but I would also point out the following. For example, my program here at the University of Central Oklahoma is not FEPAC accredited. It's not that we don't plan to be. We are well underway to become accredited, but we're only 3 years old. Our relatively young age is preparing us to be FEPAC accredited, but we have to have a certain number of graduating classes, and we're waiting on that to apply. So, um, you know, certainly it's important. We think it's important enough to go after accreditation. Um, but don't be turned away simply because they're not accredited. Ask, are you seeking it? Are you applying for it?
Yeah, I would fully agree with both of those statements. I've been a site inspector for 3 different programs, and certainly I see the value. I will add a little bit to what Dwight was just saying, that in addition to the idea that it's important for the folks to understand how important accreditation is, there's also a pushback by many universities in that they don't. There's this somewhat well-known dichotomy of thought between, I guess I would characterize it as pure science and applied science. And there's many, UC Berkeley is a good example of it, where George Sensabaugh, who just recently retired, had an extremely successful program, but it was him and him alone there at Berkeley. And for the longest time, I know that he struggled to try to do movement towards growing the program and creating a larger group there. He was very successful just because of his own network of folks that he created. So the word of caution is that it's not the only thing that you should be looking at. It's something that is, everybody appreciates the value that it brings. And in fact, the Academy and several other groups are now only offering certain scholarships to FEPAC accredited university students. But there is definitely, and I'm sure that both Dwight and Larry have experienced this, the sort of dichotomy of thinking that because you're in applied science, you're not a real science, and the level of support is a very difficult thing.
But one thing, Steve, I do think you're right, and these are battles that we all face, but I think the landscape's changing a bit. There was a white paper written by the National Science Foundation a few months back that said, and they sent it out to a lot of different people, and it wasn't just the forensic scientists, and they said that for the first time, we're going to start providing research grants for forensic science research. And I think, one of the things that I look at as the maturation of forensic science education is how lawyers and how many graduate schools that are not involved in forensic science now are willing to hire students from forensic science programs. I'll give you an example. I talked to some of the folks down at Eastern Kentucky University, and they have a bachelor's program in forensic science. Last year, they got students accepted to PhD programs in chemistry at Duke, Vanderbilt, and Purdue. And that was not something that probably would have happened 20 years ago. And I do think that I think FEPAC has done a lot to help with the acceptance of forensic science in other scientific areas, and even in forensic science. I know for years we wouldn't have an undergraduate degree in forensic science because there were laboratory directors who would tell me, I'm never going to hire somebody with a bachelor's degree in forensic science because we just don't think that they have, for instance, the requisite amount of chemistry. But I do think that FEPAC has changed that so much that I've changed my own thinking on that. And, next year for the first time, we're going to be offering a bachelor's degree in forensic science because I think that FEPAC has helped change the.
Oh, no, I fully agree with you, Larry. I think that the attitudes are clearly changing. And most recently, I was mentioning this to John Tonkin. there was a sort of summary article of some scientific publications in a journal called The Economist. And really the upshot of the article was that all of this groundbreaking academic science, in many instances when academics try to reproduce the science, it's not reproducible. So, and then they go on to highlight, studies that have been done in, quote unquote pure science, where the top 50 discoveries in cancer research, 50 of them were attempted to do the same research in the laboratory, and only 30% of them were reproducible. And they went on, a lot of times the reason why these things are getting pushed forward is journals want new, exciting research. They don't want something that has been done already. And because reproducing somebody's result is something that's not currently in many journals not publishable. And as I was reading that article, I was thinking, forensic science, of course there's new things that we do as well, but there's a lot of science that we do that refines what we've done. And so we do a lot of science which is repetitive and sort of validates the work that's being done. And I was just thinking as I was reading this article that they're not encompassing our field in their paradigm. So I believe, I also believe that FEPAC has done an amazing job. We are certainly have for many years been, pushing against the kinds of thought processes that have gone on, I think, in many places. So I think, there is a good reason to be hopeful that the tide has turned and it will continue to support the accreditation.
Great. Thank you so much for your answers, and thank you so much for your participation in this webinar. I wanted to bring up one more resource that may be useful to the audience here is the Young Forensic Scientists Forum, which can be found at yfsf.aafs.org. There may be some more information here that can help guide you in your upcoming career.
That's a really good point. They actually have their own poster session at the Academy meeting. They have a platform presentations for research as well, and it's a really good resource for students who are interested in forensic science as a career, and those people at the start of their career.
So if there is nothing further that you guys would like to add, I think we're ready to bring this webinar to a close.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Yes, thank you.